Hi, I'm Tim Floyd. I'm the Director of Youth and Young Adult Ministries for the Kansas-Nebraska Conference. I want to say thank you to Shalina for inviting me to share a little bit about a resource that I've come across recently that I think will help in families and in churches and Sabbath school and Pathfinders and clubs and every other kind of ministry that involves young people. So as I share a little bit about this book that I've come across recently, I wanted to share some insights and a summary of it. Now, obviously, it's just a summary. There's so much more information, and for that, you really just need to read the book. So, to begin, every teenager is a walking bundle of questions. For students that you know, the questions are in the driver's seat. They may be about race, they may be about friends or money or grades or abuse, justice, sports, future, family, social media, or mental health. Sometimes kids' questions leak out and they're muttered out loud, but more commonly they remain bottled inside of a teenager's curious mind and their conflicted soul. Either way, we'll never activate this generation if we don't understand their most pressing questions. You're likely watching this because you want to understand teenagers and maybe you want to have a better connection and conversations with them. You're maybe a mentor, a teacher, youth worker, small group leader, a parent, a step-parent, a grandparent, pastor, church member, neighbor, aunt, uncle, or a boss, or someone who just wants to help address the questions of young people in general. And likely, some of you may be a few young people yourselves. As a youth servant, we love listening to teenagers' tough questions, as well as equally tough questions about teenagers asked by our churches and ministries and families. The best questions that we can ask ourselves are the ones that are actually spoken and not just stuck in our heads. Over the last couple of years, Fuller Theological Seminary conducted some surveys, focus groups over 2,200 teenagers, as well as in-depth multi-session interviews with 27 youth groups and high school students nationwide. Among the questions tumbling through every teenager's mind at any given point, this presentation focuses on just a snapshot of these questions, which often floated up to the top of the research. A common question: how do I manage anxiety and stress better? I rarely go a day without a youth leader or parent asking about young people's anxiety or stress and how can we help them manage it better. That prevalence makes sense given the anxiety that most commonly is faced today. In fact, psychological disorders in the U.S. affecting nearly 1/3 of adolescents and adults in their lifetime. 1/3 is a very large proportion of people dealing with some sort of anxiety or stress. So if you're a youth leader, if you have, let's say, 20 students, somewhere around the neighborhood of 7 of them will suffer from a diagnosable anxiety disorder. Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, mental health challenges skyrocketed across the U.S. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, anxiety tripled from 1.8% to 25.5%, and depression almost quadrupled from 6.5% to 24.3%. That's a lot of extra anxiety just because of COVID. Approximately half of young adults 18 to 24 during the pandemic were wrestling with depression or anxiety. Suicide is currently the second leading cause of death for U.S. young people ages 10 to 24. What's more, approximately 2 out of every 3 young people have suicidal thoughts that never get help. A few of the 27 students that Fuller interviewed had contemplated or even taken steps toward killing themselves. One 11th grader who is active in his church, remembered feeling emotionally swallowed up by academic and social pressures. He said, "On school days, I couldn't even make it until 10 or 11 a.m. My anxiety was just crazy. I got to the point that I wanted to kill myself." He said, "I called a suicide hotline and I was put into a hospital with security guards around my bed to keep me from harming myself." He said that was my lowest point. Poignantly, the help that he received during hospitalization helped him peer beyond the curtain of his own emotions and discover what he was ultimately longing for. He said, "I finally realized that when I was in that hospital bed, I realized that I didn't want to hurt myself. I just needed somebody to listen to me and to be there for me." In regards to technology, young people today, they don't really have many questions. They kind of get it. If you're like me, you have tech problems, you hand your device to a young person that's nearest you and you resist the impulse of throwing it out the window instead. And today's young people, today's teenagers have mastered technology and they're now pioneering new paths forward in technology. According to the latest research, nearly all, 95%, of U.S. teens have access to a smartphone, and about half say they're on them almost constantly. They're almost always on the internet of some sort, whether it's an app or the actual internet itself. Almost 3/4 report often or sometimes checking for messages or notifications as soon as they wake up, and approximately 4 out of 10 feel anxious when they don't have their cell phone with them. I can relate to that a little bit. I am quite tied to my phone. In fact, I've got it right here, right now. Roughly half 13 to 17-year-olds are worried that they spend too much time on their smartphones. That's an interesting self-observation, that roughly half of 13 to 17-year-olds are worried that they spend too much time on their smartphones. 68% of young people who are active on social media have received support in tough times through their cell phones, through their social media outlets. Now, it's interesting. I run a summer camp, and one of the things that I often observe through retreats and groups that come out, and even during our summer ministry program, it's more often than not the adults that are on their phones instead of young people, but it's interesting how self-aware young people are to the challenges of distractions of cell phones. It's interesting. With ubiquitous technology comes new temptations and conflict. One survey of teenagers, 32% admitted intentionally accessing online pornography. Of these, 43% did so on a weekly basis. During the course of the interviews, an upperclassman revealed his struggle with online pornography. From 6th to 9th grade, he struggled with it. He said, "I was inundated with social media and introduced to all sorts of heinous stuff, like porn and all kinds of things." He said, "There's a whole bunch of mess that I got sucked into, and no one knew that I was even doing it." He said, "I just deleted my online history and got away with it." He said, "I was watching things I shouldn't have been, and I knew it." And he said, "It was really horrible for me." Now, turning to another downside of technology, a junior that was interviewed in this research, he said that he was one out of 15% of U.S. high school students victimized by electronic bullying. Another said that she was an African-American minority in her school, and that other students used to use race as a weapon against her online. No fists were ever thrown, but because she was different, insults were tossed at her and words were used, and this was both at school and in her digital world. She had nowhere safe to be. While this 11th grader shared specific detail about her aspects of her life, she didn't seem to want to give too many specifics about what was actually done, about how the pain impacted her. They asked her to tell her more about the bullying and that she had experienced, and she paused and she gave a vague answer like, name-calling. Not that people wanted to be with me, that was basically it. Nobody wanted to be with me, and they used names to justify that. They used words to hurt me. And then she lowered her gaze and she stared at the coffee house table in between the interviewer and her, and she sighed, and she added one final softly spoken, "Yeah." A common question in regards to generational diversity, they ask a lot of them are asking, how do we navigate all the racial pain in our country right now? U.S. Census statistics help us understand why this generation is so aware of ethnic and cultural diversity, and why so many are actively seeking racial justice and reconciliation. Today in the U.S., approximately half of those under 18 are white, and half are people of color. 1/4 of that same age group are first or second generation immigrants. We might conclude from this data that if you're a leader or teacher or mentor, that about 50% of your children and teenagers that you love and serve are likely to be white, and 50% are likely to be from another ethnicity, or 2, sometimes 3 or more ethnicities. And if you're a parent, about half of your teenagers' friends are white, and half are likely to be people of other color. However, America's racial reality is that our neighborhoods and schools and churches remain relatively segregated. In some cases, students experience diverse classmates and then go home to a monocultural neighborhood. For other teenagers, church is the most segregated environment of their week. And still for others, most every context of their lives is populated with people who look exactly like them and share very similar backgrounds. Often with fresh eyes, teenagers see racial segregation and injustice surrounding them, and they are eager to work toward unity and healing. They are an incredibly empathetic generation. They are drawn towards healing. In the midst of young people's varied and ethnic and racial and cultural experiences, many of them have these great opportunities to cross boundaries and build cultural bridges. Claudia, for example, she's a 17-year-old Latina, and she loves traditional Mexican dishes, but she also enjoys Korean drinks and treats. And she intentionally introduces her Latino friends to Korean cuisine and invites her Korean friends to enjoy Mexican food in her home and in her neighborhood. While this cultural exchange can sometimes create tension for Claudia and many other students that were interviewed, Claudia also enjoys watching both sets of friends try new foods. Claudia summarized her experience to say, "Although I got some of their culture, I also got to share some of mine, and they actually loved it. It's so much fun." Another common question is, how do I best handle gender identity and sexual orientation? For younger generations, this is an issue that is far more exacerbated by social media than generations before. In 2016, about 10 million people, or about 4.1% of the U.S. adult population, identified as LGBTQ, which is a modest but noteworthy increase from the 8.3 million, or about 3.5% of adults who said they were in 2012. In one national study across generations, the youngest cohort surveyed, young adults ages 18 to 36, was by far the most likely to identify as LGBTQ. That's 7.3%. In addition, it's estimated that somewhere between 0.7% and 1.8% of U.S. high school students identify as transgender. Gabriel, for example, is a recent graduate who describes himself as pansexual because he said, "I want to date someone for who they are." Taylor, another young person that was interviewed, is a high school junior, prefers the pronoun they. Taylor describes themselves as non-binary Christian, vegan, loving and empathetic, really gay, and really quiet. When Taylor came out in middle school, many of Taylor's friends and family grew distant and seemed afraid of them. "My brother," Taylor said, "my brother and I did not talk for 6 months because he didn't accept me. And that was really hard." Taylor says, "By now, he accepts me. And he really likes me," and stuff like that. "I hear other people and friends that he corrects when they call me his sister because he knows how I feel about gender identity. He knows that it's important to me." Today's young people who identify as straight, non-transgender are also navigating new questions with their gay and transgender non-binary peers, including which terms do I use and what do they even mean? As Steve, a high school senior from North Carolina, noted about one of his closer friends, his girlfriend identifies as male, so I guess he's pansexual, and I respect what they do and what they believe. I use the pronouns that they want me to use because I respect them. I'm not going to judge him. I'm not going to judge his boyfriend, girlfriend. It's hard for him to keep up. I'm not going to put him down. I'm going to realize that this is his situation, this is where he is right now, and it's different, and I respect that. It's one of the interesting things about younger generations. They seem much more open and tolerant about people who are just different from them. They don't place an extra moral burden on it. They just love the people. Another important question that young people are asking when it comes to sexual activity is, how do I figure out what's best for me? The percentage of teenagers who reportedly had said that they have had sex or are currently having sex has steadily dropped over the last decade from 48 to 40%. As a percentage of those who are currently sexually active went from 35% down to 29%. While these trends are promising, sexual temptations and hazards and missteps remain part of young people's journeys. For example, for today's tech-savvy students, sharing new digital photos and videos is often an expected part of a high school relationship. During our interviews with young people, one of our team discussed a variety of sexual issues with young people and asked a 16-year-old who had dated one serious boyfriend in high school, "What is something that you've learned about yourself because of your dating in that one relationship?" She responded, "I've learned to have a little bit more self-confidence." The interviewer followed up with, "How did that come up in your dating relationship?" She said, "Well, a lot of times you say no to something and the person you're dating kind of makes you feel bad about it, so you do it anyway." She said, "I wish that I had been more confident so I could have stuck with my no instead of giving in." One extremely sad reality that raises a lot of questions for young people today is, how can I stay safe at school? And why isn't more being done by adults to change things? You remember crouching under your school desk in elementary or high school during your annual earthquake or tornado drills, depending on what part of the country you grew up in. I grew up in Kansas, and so we had tornado drills, and we had actual tornadoes that were not a drill. Today's young teenagers, they still do these drills, but they've added nationwide, they've added other things to their campuses. They've added a second drill to their safety protocol. That's active shooter drills. In Sandy Hook Elementary School, shooting was in 2012. Parkland, Florida, shooting was in 2018. No wonder 59% of 5th through 12th graders report feeling safe at school. Only 59% feel safe at school. I remember a time when school was supposed to be the safe place. A similar proportion, 57% of teenagers, are worried about the possibility of a shooting happening at their own school, with 1 out of 4 saying they're very worried. This fear is higher and higher among students of color. A teenager's underlying concern isn't just about school being dangerous, but also that adults can't, or maybe won't, protect them from violence. No longer waiting for adults, young people have been the forefront of recent movements for legislative change addressing gun regulation across the country. Young people are at the forefront of a lot of changes in the country. When it comes to drugs and alcohol, vaping, and young people are asking, is it okay for me to try? Experimentation is a hallmark of adolescence, and it's no surprise that drugs and alcohol are often in the mix for high schoolers. But the trends are shifting in this area too. Overall, substance abuse is really declining among teenagers, and this is really great news. The percentage of young people who reported using illegal drugs has fallen from 23% in 2007 to only 14% in 2017. And as a percentage of those who have injected illegal drugs, it went from 1% down to, from 2% down to 1.5% over that same decade. The percentage of 10th and 12th graders who have consumed alcohol in the past year saw a significant 5-year drop, down to 38% and 52%, respectively. Went from 52% down to 38% of those who consumed alcohol in the last year. That's a huge drop. Glaring and alarming exception to these encouraging downturns is actually vaping or the use of electronic cigarettes. Over 1/3, or 35%, of 12th graders have vaped nicotine in the last year, along with a distressing 17% of 8th graders. Around 20% of the 10th and 12th graders that have vaped, they've used marijuana within the last 12 months. That's 20% have used marijuana instead of nicotine, which is more than double 2 years ago. So vaping is definitely on the rise. In Fuller's interviews for this research, they didn't ask directly about drugs or alcohol or vaping, and a few students voluntarily disclosed their own encounters. The interviewers were buoyed when one senior who leads his school's Christian club noted that a lot of my friends openly mock me for my faith in class and refer to me as a dumb priest or a dumb Jesus guy. And I know these students are actively cutting and depressed, and they're looking for help. They're addicted, they're vaping. And when they're in the midst of broken moments, at least 3 of them have come to me, he said, and they asked me specifically, what makes you so happy, and how can I get some of that? That's a pretty powerful testament to the power of young people being an influence on each other. Now, another challenging question that young people are asking is, how is God relevant to me? While the senior who leads his school's Christian club is known for his faith on campus, many churched young people, when asked how God is relevant to them, answer not much at all. And that's troubling for me as a pastor. Over 15 years, we've been trying to answer questions about young people's faith throughout the research with Fuller, with the Growing Young Adventist study, with the Barna collaboration to understand young people leaving the church. We've been trying to understand young people and their relationship to Christ. Many of these questions that we've been looking at come from leaders, parents, mentors, and people like you as well. And these, maybe it's true for you as well. Maybe you worry about the young people that are in your life. Multiple studies indicate that 40 to 50% of young people, including those you know, who have been involved in your local church ministry, that they will actually drift from God and from the church after they graduate from high school. By most estimates, you could flip a coin, and half will stay in the church and active, and half will leave it. So to visualize the children and teenagers that you care about most, visualize who you've got in your life that are young people, and imagine half of them leaving their faith behind when they enter adulthood. And it's not just teenagers and young adults who are experiencing a spiritual decline. The proportion of U.S. adults who describe themselves as Christian has dropped a whole 12% in the last decade. It's down to 65%. While that's disheartening, the data about young people is even more revealing. In those same surveys, only 49% of millennials, the youngest age group polled, described themselves as Christians, making them the least likely generation to do so. 49% describing themselves as Christian. In a similar vein, the religious nones, or those who describe themselves as atheist or no religious affiliation, agnostic, nothing in particular, it stands now at 26%, and it's up 17% since 2009. These statistics are daunting, but we want to hear more from our young people themselves. So throughout this 27 high school student interviewed for this study, 2,700 high school students that were interviewed for this study, all of them were involved in church youth groups. The centrality of their faith was certainly up for question. Some of them were exploring faith in creative and thoughtful ways, while others seemed to have kept their faith private. In one of these interviews, our team member Taylor Greenway asked a Midwestern high schooler, "How would you say your faith has shaped your sense of identity?" And there was a long pause before the student answered. "Not like huge amount," he said. "My faith shapes part of who I am, I guess." Tyler nudged him for specifics. "In what ways do you think your faith has shaped you?" It's made me more respectful." Pressing a little bit further, Tyler said, "So how important would you say your faith is to you?" "Oh, I'd say it's very important." Tyler finally offered, "So on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being not at all important and 5 being extremely important, how would you describe your faith?" The young person said, "Maybe like a 3. It's part of my life, but it's not my whole life, I guess." One difficult question that emerged often was, will adults please stop giving me answers to questions that I'm not asking? Today's teenagers can access almost any information they want right here. They can instantaneously receive scores of possible answers, any number of questions that they could ask. In fact, they could even ask Siri to give them an answer, and they'll do it right there on the spot from their phone. And also questions that maybe they haven't even asked. They can find new questions on their smart devices. But they're also growing up in churches and families that shy away from some of their deepest questions about faith and meaning. One of the reasons young people are drifting from faith is that churches aren't focused on questions that they care most about. Instead, they're pitching answers to questions that aren't anywhere near their strike zone. We're too often stuck on questions that are from the past, questions that we were interested in when we were their age. And these young people today aren't even interested in those types of topics. It's not even on their radar. Or we're missing what's unfolding in the present. We're afraid of what's to come in the future, and we're not even looking toward those things. During a recent Fuller Youth Institute Summit, executive director from a national training organization shared about one high school student who yearned for the church to stop giving, he said, "I wish the church would stop giving me answers to questions I'm not even asking." Specific questions that he had and other teenagers that they most value might be unique from time to time, but questions aren't new to God. Questions in general are a part of the Gospels. Jesus was asked 183 questions throughout the 4 Gospels. That's remarkable, but what's even more remarkable is that Jesus himself asked 307 questions. The question isn't whether their faith is big enough to hold young people's questions. We know it is. The question is whether we will take the time to hear and honor their questions. One of the most counterintuitive findings over the years has been the role of doubt in teenagers' spiritual formation and their spiritual development. In the research for Fuller's Sticky Faith book, 70% of former youth group students admitted to having significant questions about faith while in high school. 70% had questions. Significant questions at that. Any temptation to panic can be calmed by this interesting research twist. Those teenagers with doubts who felt the freedom and had the opportunity to express their questions actually showed greater faith maturity in the long run. Allowing them to have their questions is crucial. Put more simply, it's not doubt that's toxic to faith, it's silence. tough questions are most likely to sabotage faith when adults stifle those questions in the first place. As it turns out, there are three big questions driving all the rest of these questions I've been talking about. Many of the questions that are on our minds of our teenagers today, they've unearthed three primary common themes that are believed to undergird all the rest of the questions. These queries may not live right on the surface, but when you dig deep enough, you can trace their longings at the roots to these three themes. In fact, every question young people are asking ultimately finds its genesis in these three big questions. Who am I? Where do I fit? And what difference can I make? We've created a shorthand phrasing to think about and explore these questions. First, identity, which means our view of ourselves. Then, belonging, defined as our connection with others. And finally, purpose, our contribution to the world. Now, those questions overlap, they're interrelated, and they're best understood together. I highly recommend picking up this book and diving into it. It's called Three Big Questions That Change Every Teenager. It's by Kara Powell and Brad Griffin. The subtitle is Making the Most of Our Conversations and Connections. I can't recommend it enough. I strongly suggest that all youth leaders or parents involved with young people today, anybody who works with young people, get a copy of this book. For much of the book, they wrestle with these big questions, and that they're penning down these teenagers' thoughts into very concise and understandable questions that we as leaders need to understand how they're thinking and how they're approaching faith. And sometimes it's not about having answers to their questions, but just listening to them in the first place. I should say that while their research focused on young people, these questions cut across all generations. They aren't just young people questions, they're people questions. And they aren't relevant only to adolescents. They're relevant to all of us, to you and to myself. But for young people, these three big questions of identity, belonging, and purpose are constant. They're a rolling boil in their lives. Young people need adults like you to journey with them through their big questions of life. You can be an adult who sees God's potential for a young person's identity, belonging, and purpose when all they see is defeat and dead ends. Whether you're married or single, paid or volunteer, a church, a parachurch, a parent, a single, step-parent, foster parent, grandparent, empty nester, non-parent, you can have better connections and conversations with teenagers as they trailblaze toward God's answers. God's best answers are always better than our answers, and really it's about that journey with them. And you can do it. I know you can. I'm cheering for you, and I'm praying for your relationship with these young people. And I'm praying for our young people too, that they will see God's love through you. I hope this helps you better understand young people in your life and in your ministry. We've all been teenagers, but few of us have been teenagers in the world which they inhabit today, facing the things that they face, facing the issues and challenges and questions that they have today. Very few of us had to grow up in a formative time like today. A little empathy and patience on our part will go a long way as we try to share Christ with them. No matter how we feel about their decisions or struggles, we have to follow Christ's method of patient love as they journey toward Him. We can be a part of that journey. As Fuller often says, our job is not to judge, but to journey alongside them toward Christ, together. Thank you for watching this presentation, and thank you for your service to our young people. It's my prayer that your ministry and your families will flourish as we all journey together toward Christ.